Hi everyone, FoxxC here again. I'm working really hard on my next episode of FoxxTales, but in the meantime, I've got more in store for you. As the almighty algorithm must be appeased at frequent intervals, I've concocted some additional content for your approval. I have some more playful stuff coming up in the next few weeks, but for today, we're going to take a more studious look at a conversation that's been getting a lot of attention lately, and try to explain why certain ideologies have so much trouble with it. That conversation is consent. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. That stuff about sex has been done to death. People seem to be starting to get that no means no, and yes has to be a specific kind of yes. And you're right! People are having this conversation, and it's wonderful. Amelia Jane over on her channel recently made a couple of great videos saying no is bullshit, and sometimes yes is bullshit too, where they do a wonderful job explaining the nuance of the subject in a really accessible way. I recommend you take some time to check them out, as a critical breakdown of sexual consent is a useful starting point for a broader analysis of the idea of consent. I also mention Aim's videos because they helped me put together conditions of consent that I want to work with in this video. Number 1, it is active and enthusiastic. Number 2, it is ongoing. That means it needs constant renewal. Number 3, it is prior informed, freely given with full knowledge of the consequences. Now that we're clear on how I'm using the term, let's take this definition of consent and examine how it relates to liberal ideology. Spicy.
The consent of the governed.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Nothing quite like a revolutionary document, is there? To secure these rights, governments are instituted among people, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The colonists who signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776 weren't just pulling this idea of consent out of thin air either. The world had been chewing on the idea of what legitimized the rule of the state, the king, and aristocracy for quite some time already, and the New Americans were looking for ideas nearly a century old to provide a framework for their claim to power in the new Union of States. They found a large part of the justification in the two treaties of government published by John Locke in 1689, and the state of nature arguments found therein. And those arguments are all grounded in, you guessed it, consent.
Consent and social contract theory.
This discussion of political consent is a cornerstone of classical liberalism and what is called social contract theory. It has its roots with Socrates, but became popularized by Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, published in 1651, before being developed further by Locke and later Jean-Jacques Rousseau among the classical liberals. Social contract theory is an idea that many contemporary political philosophers think is a pretty suspect justification for government, but still forms the basis of many of the political institutions and opinions you'll find in the public sphere. Former UK PM and arch-liberal Tony Blair appealed to the social contract just last week to justify his demands that immigrant populations do a better job of integrating to stop the rise of the far right.
Without the rights to, for example, practice one's faith, diversity would have no content. But without the duty to integrate, culture, or faith, can be used as a way of upsetting the basic social contract that binds us together. Particularly now, when there is an increasing evidence of far-right bigotry on the rise, it is important to establish the correct social contract around the rights and duties of citizens, including those who migrate to our country.
Peak liberalism. Locke argues that, from his state of nature, where all men, just men, white Christian men, are free and equal, they consent to enter into society with one another to protect their natural rights to property by giving up some other rights, notably the right to violence in defense of said property, to the state. Locke uses this same idea to back up things like financial accumulation and inequality as well. The fact that we consent to use money apparently means that we consent to material inequality, according to this charmer. And, I don't really remember giving consent for money to be a thing, right? That would be pretty silly anyhow, because money's been around a lot longer than I have. Which brings up the problem with this idea of consent in a political sense. The governments of the countries we live in have been around a lot longer than we have as well, and they make decisions that affect our lives, sometimes quite invasively, without many of us ever making any sort of declaration of consent. That seems like sort of a big deal, especially considering we're so super keen on having our intimate relationships be based on enthusiastic, ongoing, prior informed consent. Why should we set any less of a standard for any organization that we interact with, be it business or government? Locke himself would probably really disagree with me on this point, mostly because he viewed conjugal relations, as he put it, to be a voluntary contract from the state of nature, but somehow not a political one. His reasoning is that the relationship between a man and a woman is governed by certain natural laws. And, oh, fox it. I could drop some quotes and explain this in detail, but, it all boils down to Locke thinking that women are there for procreation. Family is the base unit of society for procreation. The conjugal relationship is completely apolitical for procreation, and it's all naturally governed by the superior man. Hashtag cis-heteropatriarchy. Keep all that in mind through this next bit. In order to avoid this problem of consent for future generations, Locke introduces the idea of tacit consent. Tacit means silent in Latin, and Locke defines the concept thusly. The difficulty is what ought to be looked upon as a tacit consent, and how far it binds, i.e., how far anyone shall be looked on to have consented, and thereby submitted to any government, where he has made no expressions of it at all. And to this I say, that every man that hath any possession or enjoyment of any part of the dominions of any government doth hereby give his tacit consent, and is as far forth obliged to obedience to the laws of that government during such enjoyment. You play by the rules, even if you don't agree. And if you're in that conjugal relationship, you play by the rules, even if you don't agree. Yeah, tacit consent. Silent consent. This is the part of the lecture where I'd ask the class if they can see any problems with this definition of consent, and we'd have a nice conversation about things like coercion, economic and otherwise, the idea of whether you can actually consent if you can't leave. That is, if there is nowhere else to go. Does enjoyment equal obligation if you can't opt out of enjoyment? Then we'd spend several classes talking about other arguments for consent in social contract theory, look at other philosophers, and really dig into the idea of political consent in a broad and meaningful way. We could talk about the fact that even Rousseau had a conception of ongoing political consent that, in his idea of the social contract, that made it hard to justify the authority of most governments we have today in the 1700s. We might even compare it back to ideas around sexual consent. Shocking, I know. I really don't want to go through all that, though, which is why I started off mentioning Ames videos, and I've also linked videos by more boring academic philosophers in the discussions below. Instead, let's look at why a broader definition of consent is such a big problem for self-described classical liberals by exposing the topic of political consent to the magic of intersectional analysis.
Gender, race, and consent.
I think we've clearly established that a robust idea of consent is present in classical liberalism. So why the Fox do you get classical liberals saying stuff like this?
Content warning, lobster boy, and possible rape mention.
Okay, and now it's 50, 60 years later, and we're trying to sort this out. It's like, well, when is it okay to have sex? Exactly. And when is it not okay to have sex? And what does it mean that it's okay? And what does consent mean? And the answer to that is, well, we never used to have to think these things through because the rule was don't have sex until you get married. That was the rule. Now that isn't the rule. Okay, so what's the rule? Well, we're not having a conversation about the rule. I don't think that sex works very well outside of committed relationships. I don't think there's any evidence that it does. There's a strong proclivity across cultures for the enforcement, social enforcement of long-term monogamy. And there's reasons for that. And I think you deviate from that at your peril. The question is, well, what constitutes consent? And we need to have a very serious conversation about that. Like, under what circumstances is it acceptable to give consent? But we're not mature enough to have that conversation.
Sorry to put you through that, but, well, how can an ideology think it's mature enough to go to war over the idea of consent of the governed? Well, at the same time, it's not mature enough to deal with the demands of enthusiastic, ongoing, prior informed consent in the context of a sexual relationship. It all goes back to that special conjugal relationship that Locke talks about. Remember how a relationship between a man and a woman is specifically apolitical? Liberals consider the family to be the base political unit, organized under a man, and it is the family that enters into political agreements. When women demand full consent, they are, effectively, transforming the special conjugal relationship into a political one. When a liberal or conservative is hand-wringing over family values, this is really what they're worried about. According to Locke, conjugal society is made by a voluntary compact between man and woman, and though it consists chiefly in such a communion and right in one another's bodies as is necessary to its chief end, procreation. Well, that's really fox and creepy. A right in one another's bodies? Sorry, Locke, bud. But we know whose right you're talking about. This is why Free and equal sexual consent is free and equal political consent. And this challenges the very foundation of the conjugal relationship on which liberals construct their ideology. This is in part what the second wave feminists were talking about when they asserted that the personal is political. It sucks that most of them turned out to be TERFs. Feminist scholars got around to specifically critiquing the social contract theory in the 1980s, with Carol Pateman arguing in her book, The Sexual Contract, that there is another original pact underlying the social contract, that of men to dominate and control women. One of Locke's fundamental arguments is against the idea of the patriarchal right to political power, as is found in the Divine Right of Kings, and so the ideology appears at first to be opposed to patriarchy. This isn't really the case, however, and this is the crux of Pateman's argument. While the single patriarch may have been overthrown, his downfall came at the hands of a fraternal group who agreed to share the resources they now have access to, including the women. Instead of getting rid of the patriarchy, social contract theory just shifts the concentration of power over women from one father figure to the general group of dudes who form the social contract. This is very similar to the shift from the ceramic universe to the fully automatic universe that I talk about in my Alan Watts video. They got rid of the lawmaker, but they kept the law. The natural law that keeps women subordinate. Their consent is still not relevant, and the social contract, with its special category of the biological family, becomes one of the fundamental pillars upholding the new patriarchy. The problem for liberal ideology is even more pronounced when you start to introduce LGBTQ2AI+ identities, because rather than merely politicize the institution of the biological family, these relationships begin to radically redefine it. Men in gay relationships get asked, "Who's the girl?" in part, I think, because people are trying to figure out who has political authority in that family. While lesbian relationships are largely ignored because there is no man to represent the family politically. Trans people make it impossible to identify a person as a holder of political authority, directly challenge the nature of biological family. Trans men having babies? And the fact that anyone who voluntarily gives up their apparent political power, as in the case of a trans woman, would be considered to be acting against their rational self-interest. That really throws liberal ideology into a tizzy, and causes people to consider trans people to be mentally ill. This is why I think even moderate liberals are willing to compromise on the political consent, as well as the rights, freedom, and safety of women and vulnerable minorities in order to uphold the commitment to the dominant social structure. If we don't count as part of the body politic, then our consent doesn't matter. To their credit, progressive liberals have been comfortable in welcoming more equality and the groups being represented under their ideological umbrella. Some might call this co-opting of identity, in order to claim the consent of whatever identity groups are intersected by the individual they raise to power. This representation doesn't really solve the problem of meaningful political consent for marginalized groups, however, and still favors individuals who reinforce the other facets of the traditional family, like monogamy or amatonormativity. I'd better define that one, hey? Amatonormativity. The assumption that exclusive amorous relationship is normal for humans, in that it is a universally shared goal,
and that such a relationship is normative in the sense that it should be aimed at in preference to other relationship types. I prefer a more radical view of family and relationships, however, like that of Shulamith Firestone writing in The Dialectic of Sex, The Case for Feminist Revolution. Marx was onto something more profound than he knew when he observed that the family contained within itself, in embryo, all the antagonisms that later develop on a wide scale within the society and the state. For unless revolution uproots the basic social organization, the biological family, the vinculum through which the psychology of power can always be smuggled, the tapeworm of exploitation will never be annihilated. And now we have memes that assert a family can be anything! I'm filled with hope. Well, sort of. There's one last really uncomfortable facet of social contract theory that I haven't got to yet, and that is how it treats people who aren't white. Building off the work of Carol Pateman, Charles Mills' 1997 book, The Racial Contract, sets out to examine how women and non-white people hold a similar position relative to the social contract. Like Pateman's original pact between men that gives them dominion over women and precedes the consensual social contract, so too is there a racial contract decided on by white men to determine who may count as a fully moral and political person. Full persons can consent and enter the social contract, with all the subsequent rights to property and the power to form other contracts. Everyone else, well, you get to be the objects of the contracts. Mills makes the further argument that the racial contract isn't some sort of abstract philosophical idea, but a real contractual agreements between real historical people. Without going into too much historical detail, which would deflect the thrust of this essay, Mill's point is extremely convincing. That a series of agreements, both explicit and implicit, were made among a relatively small number of European men as to who would be considered a full person and who would be a sub-person in order to determine who is exploitable is obvious, even with a cursory reading of historical documents. That stuff is hardly subtext in Locke, and pretty much every classical liberal philosopher. But because I am at least a halfway competent scholar, I have a concrete example of such a contract. The contract drawn up by the colonial revolutionaries whose declaration I quoted. The United States Constitution and its 3/5 compromise. The effect of these agreements that precede the social contract, whether on the basis of sex or race or ability, oh yeah, Locke covers that too, is to functionally and deliberately disenfranchise entire swaths of humanity to provide justification for the exploitation of their bodies and resources without ever intending to allow them the freedom of enthusiastic, ongoing, prior informed consent that could in any way challenge the established power structure. The really insidious thing about the problem of race, according to Mills, however, is that the West believes in the myth of an idealized social contract. The American Constitution now says everyone is equal, almost. Society generally believes that people will be treated equally before the law, and that there is equality of opportunity. Mills argues that this myth covers up the political reality. Some persons will be accorded the rights and freedoms of full persons, and the rest will be treated as sub-persons. A very powerful myth indeed. Hey! It only took me like 12 pages to get around to talking about mythology. At least I'm staying on brand. Conclusion.
The social contract, with its preceding agreements, is an idea deeply embedded into the political mythology of the West, and its institutions will not be dislodged easily. I have to admit, not all of the conceptions of a social contract are completely useless. The demand that political relationships be established only by freely giving consent, and that in the face of tyranny, a revolution is a duty, are ideas that I can get behind. The only problem is, we live in a world where not a single one of our dominant institutions, public or private, government or business, can claim authority through the ideals of enthusiastic, ongoing, prior-informed consent, if those concepts are to be applied universally. So where then does that leave the oppressed? When a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.
Well, that escalated quickly. I plan a quick peek into a topic and I end up with this. If you got all the way here, thanks so much for sticking with me. I plan on examining other aspects of social contract theory more in depth in future episodes. I haven't had a chance to read all of the literature on this topic yet. There's a lot. The Pateman and Mills information is from a secondary source, and I imagine Chomsky's manufacturing consent would be very relevant to this discussion. I haven't read it. Please leave me some comments to let me know what you thought of this topic, as well as some places I could do better and maybe some resources I should look into that I haven't thought of yet. All of my sources are linked in the description down below as usual, and I give you my enthusiastic, ongoing, prior-informed consent to hit the like and subscribe buttons, ring my little bell, and check out my Patreon if you want to support the show. Till next time.
The union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run. There can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. Now we stand outcast and starving mid the wonders we have made, but the union makes us strong.